Hunger does terrible things to a person's pride. When 20-year-old Maya hid in the freezing darkness of a billionaire's walk-in pantry, her shaking hands clutching a plate of discarded Wagyu steak, survival was her only thought. She didn't expect the heavy steel door to swing open. She certainly didn't expect Silas Sterling, the city's most ruthless crime lord, to be the one standing there, his cold eyes locking onto her terrified frame. Everyone in the underworld knew Silas punished thieves with blood, but what he did next to the starving waitress shattered every rumor and ignited a dangerous, consuming obsession. The clinking of baccarat crystal and the low, dangerous murmur of powerful men echoed through the grand ballroom of the Sterling estate. Located on a heavily guarded stretch of Long Island coastline, the mansion was a fortress masquerading as a palace. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of Tom Ford cologne, expensive Cuban cigars, and the unspoken threat of violence. This was not a gathering of polite society. This was a summit of the city's most lethal predators, hosted by the apex predator himself, Silas Sterling. Maya Brooks kept her eyes glued to the imported marble floor, balancing a silver tray of champagne flutes with trembling hands. She was an outsider here, a ghost in a stark black waitress uniform. By day, Maya worked grueling back-to-back shifts at La Tusi, a high-volume restaurant in the city, smiling through the exhaustion for meager tips. But on weekends, when the medical bills piled up and the collection agencies started calling, she donned a starched apron and joined the temporary catering staff at the Sterling estate. Her presence in this dangerous world was entirely due to her mother, Martha. Martha had been the head housekeeper for the Sterling family for a decade, a woman who knew how to clean blood out of Persian rugs just as well as she knew how to polish silver. But Martha's lungs were failing. A recent diagnosis of pulmonary fibrosis had stripped the vibrant woman of her breath and her vitality. The experimental treatments cost thousands of dollars a month, money that insurance, citing loopholes, refused to cover. Maya was drowning in debt, working herself to the bone to keep her mother breathing. Tonight, the estate was hosting a celebration. Silas Sterling had just absorbed the territories of the crumbling Romanov syndicate, a hostile takeover that had left several men at the bottom of the East River. Maya didn't care about the Mafia politics. She only cared about the $50 an hour she was being paid to serve drinks to murderers and extortionists. "Keep your head down, Maya," her mother had wheezed that morning, adjusting Maya's collar with weak hands. "Mr. Sterling is not a man who forgives mistakes. You are invisible tonight. Do you understand?" Maya understood perfectly. As she navigated the sea of tailored Brioni suits and designer gowns, she made herself as small as possible. She dodged the wandering hands of a drunk Russian oligarch and slipped past a group of local politicians who were happily accepting bribes in the shadows of the vaulted archways. From her vantage point near the grand staircase, Maya caught a glimpse of him, Silas Sterling. He didn't look like a mob boss from the movies. There were no flashy rings on his fingers, no loud suits. He was dressed in a stark, perfectly cut midnight blue tuxedo that clung to his broad shoulders. He was 32, lethally handsome, with a jawline carved from granite and eyes the color of a winter storm. He stood near the fireplace, listening to a subordinate, his expression completely unreadable. Maya watched as Silas slightly tilted his head, giving a barely perceptible nod. Two heavily armed men immediately stepped forward, grabbing a terrified-looking accountant by the arms and dragging him quietly out the side doors. The music played on. No one blinked. Maya felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. The rumors were true. Silas Sterling was a monster, wrapped in silk and sophistication. She quickly averted her gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs, and retreated towards the kitchen doors. Her legs felt like lead. She had been on her feet for 18 hours straight. Between her morning shift at the restaurant and the evening gala, she hadn't had a moment to sit down while, let alone eat. The gnawing ache in her stomach had evolved from a dull throb to a sharp, twisting agony. All her money went to the pharmacy. Her own refrigerator back at her cramped Queen's apartment was empty, save for a jar of expired mustard and half a loaf of bread. The catering kitchen was a chaotic war zone. Head chef Dubois, a tyrannical man hired specifically for his Michelin star background and his ability to keep his mouth shut, was barking orders at the line cooks. "Clear the plates from table 4, Dubois shouted, his face flushed. "And throw away that caviar. It's been sitting out for 20 minutes. It's garbage now." Maya watched in quiet horror as a busboy scraped hundreds of dollars worth of beluga caviar and perfectly seared filet mignon into a black industrial trash bag. The casual waste of wealth made her sick. It also made her fiercely, desperately hungry. Her mouth watered at the scent of truffle butter and roasted duck. She swallowed hard, pushing the dizzying wave of starvation back down, and grabbed an empty tray to return to the ballroom. She just needed to survive 3 more hours. 3 more hours, and she could take her wages, buy her mother's oxygen tanks, and maybe afford a slice of cheap pizza on the train ride home. But as the night dragged on, the hunger began to cloud her judgment. The grand clock in the hallway struck 3 a.m. The guests were finally beginning to filter out, escorted to their armored black SUVs. The music faded, replaced by the hushed, efficient sounds of the staff breaking down the event. Maya's vision blurred. The edges of the room seemed to tilt. She braced a hand against the wall, taking slow, ragged breaths to keep herself from passing out right there on the imported rugs. By 4 a.m., the mansion was eerily quiet. The caterers were aggressively scrubbing down the massive industrial kitchen, their movements hurried. Everyone wanted to leave the Sterling estate before the sun came up. Lingering around a Mafia boss's home was never a wise decision. Maya was tasked with clearing the final plates from the private dining room, where Silas and his inner circle had held their final meeting. The air in the room was heavy with stale smoke and the metallic tang of fear left behind by whoever had displeased Silas tonight. The massive mahogany table was littered with crystal glasses containing inches of Macallan 25-year-old scotch and plates of half-eaten gourmet delicacies. Her stomach let out a violent, audible rumble. Maya clutched her midsection, squeezing her eyes shut. The pain was blinding. She looked down at the table. Right in front of her was a plate containing a nearly untouched piece of Wagyu beef, resting on a bed of rich, creamy Parmesan risotto. Beside it sat a perfectly baked dinner roll, brushed with garlic herb butter. It was leftover food, scraps meant for the garbage. Chef Dubois had explicitly ordered the staff not to eat anything from the guests' tables, a strict policy to maintain professionalism. Anyone caught eating the scraps would be immediately fired without pay. Maya hesitated, her hands hovering over the plate. If she got fired, she wouldn't get her envelope of cash. If she didn't get the cash, Martha wouldn't get her medication. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to throw the food in the bin and walk away. But the primitive, starving part of her took over. She hadn't eaten a solid meal in 2 days. The smell of the roasted meat was intoxicating, overwriting her fear. She picked up the plate. She couldn't eat it out here in the open. The security cameras monitored the halls, and Harrison, the terrifying head butler, was making his final rounds. She needed somewhere dark, somewhere without cameras. Maya slipped out the side door of the dining room and hurried down the servants' corridor. She bypassed the main kitchen and approached the massive, industrial walk-in refrigerator located in the secondary pantry. It was a stainless steel vault used to store hanging meats and bulk produce, practically soundproof and entirely free of surveillance. With shaking hands, she pulled the heavy steel handle. The thick door popped open with a hiss of escaping air. Maya stepped inside, letting the heavy door click shut behind her. She was plunged into freezing darkness, illuminated only by the pale, humming fluorescent bulb overhead. The temperature was set to 34 degrees. Immediately, the icy air bit through her thin cotton uniform, raising goosebumps on her skin. But she didn't care. She sank down to the freezing, tiled floor, leaning back against a crate of imported truffles. Maya balanced the porcelain plate on her knees. She didn't have a fork. Desperation stripping away her dignity, she picked up the cold piece of Wagyu beef with her bare fingers and took a bite. The rich, savory flavor exploded on her tongue. It was cold, meant to be discarded, but to Maya, it tasted like absolute salvation. Tears prickled the corners of her eyes as she quickly shoved a handful of the cold risotto into her mouth, chewing rapidly, terrified that someone would walk in. She sat in the freezing dark, shivering violently, eating the leftovers of a ruthless criminal like a stray dog. The shame washed over her, hot and humiliating, mixing with the icy air of the freezer. This is what her life had become, hiding in a Mafia boss's refrigerator, stealing half-eaten scraps just to keep her body functioning. Just finish it and get out, she told herself, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her greasy hand. No one will ever know. Suddenly, the mechanical hum of the refrigerator was shattered by a loud, metallic clack. The heavy steel door swung open. A flood of warm yellow light spilled into the walk-in freezer, blinding Maya. She gasped, dropping the half-eaten dinner roll onto the floor. She scrambled backward, hitting the metal shelving unit with a loud crash. Her heart stopped. Every drop of blood drained from her face. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the light of the hallway, was Silas Sterling. He had shed his tuxedo jacket and his bow tie. His crisp white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of a syndicate tattoo on his collarbone. He held an empty glass in one hand, having apparently come down to the private pantry for ice. He froze, his tall, imposing frame blocking the only exit. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, the silence in the freezer was absolute. Maya couldn't breathe. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with sheer terror. She was sitting on the floor, her hands covered in cold grease, her cheap uniform stained, clutching a plate of his stolen leftovers. Everyone knew what Silas did to people who stole from him. Just last month, a dock worker had skimmed a few crates of electronics from Silas's shipping containers. The man was found with his hands crushed into pulp. Silas Sterling was a man of cold, calculated brutality. He demanded absolute perfection and absolute loyalty from everything and everyone under his roof. Silas's storm-grey eyes slowly tracked down from Maya's terrified face to the plate of discarded food in her lap, and then to the cold dinner roll resting on the floor. His expression hardened, his jaw ticking. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Please," Maya whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible over the hum of the cooling units. "Please, I'm sorry. I wasn't stealing anything valuable. It was going to the trash. Please don't fire my mother." She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the harsh shout, waiting for him to summon his terrifying enforcer, Gideon, to drag her out by her hair. She braced herself for the violence that was surely coming, but the shout never came. Instead, she heard the heavy steel door click shut, plunging them both back into the dim, humming isolation of the walk-in freezer. Maya snapped her eyes open. Silas hadn't left. He had locked them inside. He stepped closer, his polished leather shoes silent on the frosty tiles. He loomed over her, a dark, terrifying tower of power and control. Maya pressed herself flat against the metal shelves, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Silas crouched down smoothly, bringing his face level with hers. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He smelled of scotch, danger, and a cold, metallic authority. He didn't say a word. He just stared at her, his eyes stripping away her defenses, analyzing the hollows of her cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, and the desperate, humiliating reality of the plate in her hands. He reached out. Maya flinched, turning her head away, expecting a blow. Instead, Silas's large, calloused hand gently gripped the edge of the porcelain plate. He pulled it out of her grasp. He looked at the mangled, cold piece of beef and the smeared risotto. A dark, unreadable emotion flickered across his face, something that looked shockingly like raw fury. But it wasn't directed at her. Without breaking eye contact, Silas casually tossed the expensive porcelain plate to the side. It shattered against a metal crate, the loud crash echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. Maya let out a small sob of fear, wrapping her arms around her knees. Then, Silas Sterling did something that would alter the course of both their lives forever. Silas stood up slowly. He reached up and unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling the crisp white sleeves of his shirt up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and laced with scars. "Get up," Silas commanded. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It wasn't a yell, but it carried an authority that vibrated in Maya's bones. Maya's legs felt like jelly. She struggled to push herself off the freezing floor, her joints stiff from the cold and the sheer exhaustion. She stumbled forward, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Before she could hit the tiles, a strong hand shot out, gripping her upper arm with surprising gentleness, steadying her. "You're shaking," Silas noted, his tone flat, betraying nothing. I'm fine, sir. Mr. Sterling, please," Maya stammered, unable to meet his eyes. "My mother is Martha, the housekeeper. She doesn't know about this. She raised me better than this. Punish me, not her. She swallowed hard, the humiliation burning her throat. "I was hungry." Silas stared down at her. He recognized her now. He had seen Martha's daughter in passing over the years, a quiet, ghost-like girl who occasionally helped polish the silver before big events. He knew Martha was sick. His accountants handled the payroll. He knew exactly how much the housekeeper made. But looking at the girl shivering in front of him, seeing the brutal reality of her starvation, something dark and protective snapped inside the Mafia boss's chest. He didn't rule his empire by letting his people starve in the dark. "Walk," Silas ordered, turning his back on her and pushing the heavy freezer door open. Maya followed him out into the warm, dimly lit pantry, fully expecting to be led to the security office to be interrogated or beaten. But Silas didn't turn towards the servants' exit. He turned right, walking directly into the massive, pristine main kitchen. The catering staff had already cleared out. The kitchen was empty, the stainless steel countertops gleaming under the overhead lights. "Sit," Silas said, pointing to one of the high leather bar stools at the edge of the sprawling marble center island. Maya was too terrified to disobey. She climbed onto the stool, wrapping her arms around her shivering torso. The sudden warmth of the kitchen was making her lightheaded. Silas walked over to the industrial double-door refrigerator. He opened it and began pulling things out. Fresh eggs, a carton of heavy cream, a block of aged Gruyere cheese, a bundle of fresh asparagus, and a pristine, untouched cut of prime ribeye that had been resting on a Himalayan salt block. Maya watched in absolute bewilderment as the most feared man in the city set the ingredients on the cutting board. He retrieved a chef's knife from the magnetic block. With practiced, precise movements, he began to slice the steak into thin, perfect strips. "Mr. Sterling?" Maya whispered, confusion battling with her fear. "What are you doing?" Silas didn't look up from the cutting board. "You don't eat garbage in my house." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried a heavy, undeniable weight. Maya sat completely frozen, her mind short-circuiting. Was this a trick? A psychological game before he killed her? Why was Silas Sterling, a man who commanded an army of killers and controlled billions in illicit assets, standing at a stove at 4 a.m? Silas threw a knob of butter into a cast-iron skillet. It immediately sizzled and hissed. He tossed the steak strips into the pan, the rich aroma of searing meat instantly filling the kitchen. Maya's stomach betrayed her again, letting out a loud, pathetic rumble. She flushed scarlet, staring down at her worn, scuffed waitress shoes. "Martha is a loyal woman," Silas said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. He cracked 3 eggs into a glass bowl, whisking them rapidly with a fork. "She has kept my home in order for 10 years. She never speaks out of turn. She never asks questions about the men who come through the back doors with blood on their shirts." He poured the eggs into a separate pan, lowering the heat. "Loyalty is the only currency I value, Maya. Hearing him say her name sent a strange shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. If her daughter is reduced to hiding in a freezer, like a rat, to eat discarded scraps, Silas continued, his voice hardening with a sudden, suppressed anger. It reflects poorly on my ability to care for those who belong to me. I don't belong to you, Maya blurted out. The words left her mouth before her exhausted brain could filter them. She instantly slapped a hand over her mouth, terrified. You didn't talk back to Silas Sterling. You didn't challenge him. Silas paused. He slowly turned his head, locking his storm-grey eyes onto hers. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. A lesser man would have backhanded her for the disrespect. But Silas's expression didn't change. He simply held her gaze for a long, intense moment before turning back to the stove. Everyone in this city belongs to me in one way or another, he replied softly. A few minutes later, Silas turned off the burners. He slid a perfectly folded, steaming omelette stuffed with Gruyere and asparagus onto a clean plate, placing the seared steak strips beside it. He garnished it with a pinch of coarse sea salt and cracked black pepper. He picked up the plate, walked around the marble island, and set it down directly in front of Maya. He placed a heavy silver fork wrapped in a linen napkin beside it. Eat, he ordered. Maya stared at the food. The steam rose in swirling ribbons, carrying the scent of melted cheese and perfectly cooked beef. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She looked up at Silas, searching his face for the catch, for the hidden trap. Is this poisoned? She asked, her voice shaking, a hysterical edge creeping into her tone. The corner of Silas's mouth twitched, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smirk. If I wanted you dead, Maya, you wouldn't be sitting in my kitchen. Eat the damn food before it gets cold. Maya picked up the fork. Her hand was trembling so violently she could barely hold it. She took a small bite of the omelette. The warm, rich flavors coated her mouth, sending a shockwave of relief through her starved body. She closed her eyes, letting out a soft, involuntary sigh of pure pleasure. When she opened her eyes again, Silas was leaning against the counter opposite her, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her intently. His gaze was heavy, calculating, dissecting her every movement. Just then, the swinging doors to the kitchen pushed open. Harrison, the head butler, stepped in, a clipboard in his hand. Mr. Sterling, the security perimeter is secure and the... Harrison stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses, taking in the impossible scene. The untouchable, terrifying Silas Sterling, standing casually with his sleeves rolled up, cooking equipment scattered around him, while a lowly, soot-stained waitress sat at his personal island, eating a hot meal. Sir, Harrison faltered, completely thrown off balance. Is there a problem with the catering staff? Silas didn't take his eyes off Maya. There's no problem, Harrison, he said smoothly. But I want you to have my accountant draw up a new contract for Martha Brooks first thing Monday morning. Full medical coverage, paid leave until she recovers, and clear Maya's schedule at that diner she works at. Maya choked on her food, coughing violently. She stared at Silas in absolute shock. Sir? Harrison asked, looking from the boss to the waitress. What should I tell the diner? Silas finally shifted his gaze to the butler, his eyes turning cold and dead. Tell them she no longer works for them. She works directly for me now. Maya sat frozen, the hot food suddenly turning to ash in her mouth. She hadn't just been saved from starving. She had just been claimed by the devil himself. The transition from a drowning, debt-ridden waitress to a pawn in Silas Sterling's empire happened with terrifying, clinical efficiency. 48 hours after the incident in the freezing pantry, Maya's life was entirely dismantled and rebuilt by invisible hands. It started on a bleak Tuesday morning in Queens. Maya awoke to the sound of heavy knocking on the door of her cramped, drafty apartment. When she opened it, she wasn't greeted by the usual aggressive landlord demanding back rent. Instead, two men in impeccably tailored charcoal suits stood in the narrow hallway. Behind them, an elite private medical transport team was already unfolding a motorized stretcher. "Miss Brooks," the taller of the two men said, his voice flat and professional. He flashed a badge that bore the insignia of Sterling Holdings. "Mr. Sterling has arranged for your mother's immediate transfer. We are moving her to the VIP respiratory wing at Mount Sinai Hospital." Maya could only watch in stunned silence as the paramedics gently loaded a bewildered, coughing Martha onto the stretcher. For months, Maya had begged, cried, and fought with insurance representatives just to get her mother a basic oxygen concentrator. Now, Silas had snapped his fingers, and Martha was being whisked away to one of the most prestigious medical facilities in the world, under the care of a world-renowned pulmonary specialist, Dr. Alistair Reed. "What is happening?" Martha wheezed, her frail hand gripping Maya's arm as they loaded her into the back of the sleek, state-of-the-art ambulance. "Maya, how are we paying for this? We can't afford this." "It's covered, Mum," Maya lied, swallowing the massive lump of terror in her throat. "My new catering agency. They have an incredible benefits program. Just rest, please. Just let them help you." As the ambulance pulled away, the taller, suited man handed Maya a thick, black card and a set of heavy brass keys. "There is a car waiting for you at the curb. You are expected at the Sterling Tower in Manhattan at precisely 1 o'clock. Do not be late." The ride to Manhattan was a blur. The black armored SUV deposited Maya in front of a towering glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. This was the legitimate face of Silas Sterling's underworld empire, a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund and real estate conglomerate that washed the blood money clean. Maya was escorted up a private elevator that opened directly into a sprawling, penthouse-level office. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying view of the city skyline. Silas stood by the window, his back to her, speaking quietly in Russian into a secure phone. He wore a sharp, custom-fitted Tom Ford suit that screamed power and intimidation. When he finished the call, he turned to face her. His storm-grey eyes swept over her simple jeans and worn sweater, his expression completely unreadable. He gestured to a leather chair across from his massive mahogany desk. "Sit," he commanded. Maya sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their shaking. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did for my mother this morning. But I can't accept it. It's too much money. I can't possibly pay you back." Silas walked slowly around the desk, leaning against the edge of it, towering over her. "Did I ask you to pay me back, Maya?" "No, but—" "There are no buts in my world," Silas interrupted, his tone dangerously soft. He picked up a thick, leather-bound folder and tossed it onto the desk in front of her. "That is a contract. It guarantees Martha Brooks the highest level of medical care available until the day she dies. It also includes the deed to a secure, luxury apartment in Tribeca. The lease on your current residence in Queens has already been terminated." Maya's breath hitched. "Terminated? You can't just cancel my life." "I already did," Silas stated, completely devoid of empathy. "In exchange, you work for me. Not as a waitress, not as a maid. You are now my personal liaison for the Sterling Foundation, the philanthropic arm of my enterprise." Maya stared at him, her mind reeling. "A liaison? I don't have a college degree. I don't know anything about philanthropy or hedge funds. Why are you doing this?" Silas leaned in closer, the scent of expensive cologne and dark coffee wrapping around her. "Because you are invisible, Maya," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "You spent years walking through rooms filled with monsters, serving them drinks and learning how to blend into the wallpaper to survive. You noticed things, you heard things, and most importantly, you are desperate enough to be utterly loyal." He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the contract. "Sign it. Your mother breathes easy. You live comfortably, and you belong to me. Refuse, and the medical team at Mount Sinai will discharge Martha within the hour. The choice is yours." It wasn't a choice at all. It was a perfectly constructed, velvet-lined trap. With a shaking hand, Maya picked up the Mont Blanc pen resting on his desk and signed her life away to the devil. Within a month, Maya Brooks was unrecognizable, gone with the stained aprons and scuffed non-slip shoes. Under Silas's strict orders, she was outfitted by elite personal shoppers. She now wore understated but obscenely expensive Loro Piana cashmere, tailored silk blouses, and Prada heels. She lived in a sprawling, security-monitored apartment in Tribeca, and a massive black SUV driven by a silent, heavily armed man named Bruno ferried her everywhere she went. Her official title was Foundation Liaison, but the reality of her job was far darker. She was Silas's shadow. Silas brought her to high-stakes dinners, underground casino openings, and charity galas that were nothing more than thinly veiled summits for the city's corrupt elite. Maya quickly realized why Silas wanted her there. Men in power often ignored the quiet, pretty assistant standing in the corner holding an iPad. They spoke freely around her, assuming she was just window dressing. Maya absorbed every hushed threat, every whispered alliance, and every nervous twitch, reporting it all back to Silas. She was his secret weapon, and the proximity to him was intoxicatingly dangerous. They spent hours together in his private office, poring over dossiers and financial ledgers. She saw the ruthless, terrifying side of him, the man who would casually order the destruction of a rival family's shipping business without blinking. But she also saw the man who remembered she liked her coffee with 2 sugars, the man who quietly ensured her mother's favorite flowers were delivered to the hospital every Sunday. The tension between them was a physical, living thing. It crackled in the air whenever he leaned over her shoulder to point at a document, the heat of his body pressing close to hers. But the underworld is entirely devoid of secrets. It didn't take long for Silas's enemies to notice the sudden, intense elevation of a former maid's daughter. To the brutal men who ran the rival syndicates, Maya wasn't an employee. She was a glaring, unprecedented vulnerability. The boiling point arrived during a private, high-stakes dinner at Le Bernardin, a 3-Michelin-star restaurant in Midtown. Silas had booked the private dining room to negotiate a territorial dispute with the remnants of the Romanov syndicate, now led by the volatile and unpredictable Viktor Romanov. Maya sat silently at the end of the long table, a leather-bound notebook open in front of her. The air in the room was thick with barely suppressed violence. Viktor, a heavily scarred man with dead eyes, sat across from Silas, surrounded by 4 massive bodyguards. Silas had only brought his enforcer, Gideon, and Maya. "You took the docks, Sterling," Viktor sneered, slicing into a piece of seared halibut with unnecessary force. "But the supply lines from the port belong to us. That was the old agreement." "The old agreement died with your father," Silas replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of his wine. He was the picture of calm, but Maya could see the slight tension in his jaw. "The port is mine. The supply lines are mine. If you want a cut, you'll pay the new tariff." Victor's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He threw his fork down. "You think you're untouchable, Silas? You think putting on a nice suit makes you a king?" As Victor ranted, Maya's eyes darted around the room. She had learned to read the subtle body language of killers. She noticed Victor's lead bodyguard, a man with a thick neck and a serpent tattoo, slowly shifting his weight. The bodyguard wasn't looking at Silas. He wasn't looking at Gideon. He was looking directly at the sommelier, who had just entered the room carrying a fresh bottle of vintage Bordeaux. Maya frowned. She remembered the catering protocols from her waitress days. The sommelier poured a small taste for Silas, as the host. Silas nodded, and the sommelier moved to fill Victor's glass, then Silas's. But Maya caught a microscopic tremor in the sommelier's hand. She saw the way his eyes flicked nervously toward Victor's bodyguard. She also noticed that the sommelier's pristine white cuff had a tiny, dark stain on the inside edge, like dried blood. A cold spike of adrenaline slammed into Maya's chest. It's a hit. As Silas reached out to pick up his freshly poured glass of wine, Maya didn't think. She reacted on pure, desperate instinct. "Silas, wait!" Maya shouted, her voice shattering the quiet, tense atmosphere of the private room. She lunged out of her chair, her Prada heels slipping on the polished wood floor. She slammed both of her hands onto the table, deliberately knocking over Silas's crystal wine glass. The deep red liquid shattered across the white linen tablecloth like a spray of fresh blood, splashing onto Silas's cuffs and soaking into the wood. The entire room froze. The silence was deafening. Victor stared at her in shock. Gideon's hand instantly dropped to the concealed weapon under his jacket. Silas slowly lowered his hand, his storm-grey eyes fixed on the shattered glass, then slowly rising to meet Maya's terrified gaze. "What?" Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Do you think you are doing, Maya?" Maya's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pointed a shaking finger at the sommelier, who was now backing away towards the door, his face pale with terror. He's not one of the restaurant's staff," Maya gasped, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. "I know the catering manager here. They don't wear cufflinks with standard uniforms. And he looked at Victor's guard before he poured your glass." The realization hit the room like a bomb. Before the fake sommelier could reach the heavy oak doors, Gideon was on him. With a terrifying blur of motion, the enforcer slammed the man against the wall, pinning him by the throat. A small, clear vial dropped from the sommelier's sleeve, rolling across the floor and coming to a stop near Silas's shoes. Silas looked at the vial. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze to Victor. Victor's face had drained of all color. He scrambled backward, his chair tipping over with a loud crash. "Silas, wait. I didn't—" "Gideon," Silas said softly, the calm in his voice far more terrifying than a scream. "Secure the doors. No one leaves this room." Silas stood up. The aura of the sophisticated businessman vanished instantly, replaced by the lethal, cold-blooded predator that had conquered the city's underworld. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have to. The sheer, overwhelming promise of violence radiating from him was enough to make Victor's bodyguards freeze in their tracks. But what Silas did next shocked everyone in the room more than the assassination attempt itself. He didn't advance on Victor. Instead, Silas turned his back on the rival boss. He stepped up to Maya, who was trembling violently against the edge of the table, her hands covered in spilled wine. Silas reached out and gently gripped her shoulders. His thumbs stroked the sides of her neck, feeling the frantic, racing pulse beneath her skin. He pulled her flush against his chest, right in the middle of a room filled with armed enemies, shielding her entirely with his own body. "Are you hurt?" Silas whispered, his lips brushing against her hair, his voice vibrating with a dark, possessive intensity that made Maya's breath catch. No, she stammered, overwhelmed by the heat of his body and the terrifying reality of what she had just done. Silas slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder at the trembling Viktor Romanov. The look in Silas's eyes was a promise of slow, agonizing death. "You just tried to kill me in my own city," Silas said to Victor, his voice echoing in the dead, silent room. "That is a mistake, but you brought this danger near her." Silas's grip on Maya tightened, locking her to him. "That is a death sentence." The Mafia boss had just shown his hand. He had just revealed to his greatest enemies that the quiet, former waitress wasn't just an employee. She was his weakness. She was his obsession, and he was about to burn the city to ashes to protect her. The armored Range Rover Sentinel tore through the rain-slicked pavement of the FDR drive, its reinforced tires gripping the asphalt as Gideon navigated the escape route with lethal precision. Inside the dimly lit cabin, the air was suffocatingly tense. Silas sat beside Maya, his broad chest rising and falling with a tightly controlled, simmering rage. He had a custom-engraved Glock 19 resting casually on his thigh, a stark reminder that the polished billionaire facade had fully dissolved. Maya was trembling, the adrenaline of the assassination attempt at Le Bernardin finally crashing out of her system. She stared at her hands, still faintly stained with the expensive vintage Bordeaux she had shattered to save Silas's life. Victor crossed a line he can't walk back from. Gideon rumbled from the driver's seat, his eyes darting to the rear-view mirror. He breached a neutral zone. And he knew our seating arrangements, boss. He knew exactly which glass the sommelier would pour first. "I know," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He turned to Maya. Without a word, he reached into the pocket of his bespoke jacket, pulled out a pristine linen handkerchief, and gently began wiping the dried wine from her trembling fingers. The stark contrast between the ruthless crime lord preparing for war and the tender, almost reverent way he cleaned her hands made Maya's breath catch in her throat. "We are going off the grid," Silas announced. "Gideon, take us to the Catskills property." 2 hours later, they arrived at a brutalist, off-the-grid fortress, hidden deep within the sprawling forests of upstate New York. It was a masterpiece of concrete and reinforced glass, designed by a paranoid architect and heavily guarded by Silas's most loyal mercenaries. As the heavy steel gates locked behind them, sealing them away from the world, the terrifying reality of their situation set in. Inside the compound's sprawling control room, banks of monitors displayed encrypted feeds of Silas's legal and illegal operations. Silas immediately began barking orders in rapid-fire Russian to his lieutenants over a secure satellite line, coordinating the systematic dismantling of Viktor Romanov's remaining territories. Maya stood in the corner, wrapping a heavy cashmere blanket around her shoulders. She watched Silas work. For weeks, she had been the invisible girl, the frightened waitress playing dress-up in a world of wolves. But as she watched Silas pace the floor, a dark, heavy realization settled over her. Victor hadn't just gotten lucky. He had inside information, and Maya knew exactly how he got it. "Silas," Maya said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the chaotic noise of the control room. He paused, lowering the satellite phone. He gestured for the mercenaries to step outside. Within seconds, the heavy doors clicked shut, leaving them completely alone. "You shouldn't be in here, Maya. You need to rest," Silas said, closing the distance between them. The coldness in his eyes softened the moment he looked at her. "Victor's money is bleeding through your own charity foundation," Maya stated plainly, dropping the blanket and walking over to the massive glass table covered in financial ledgers. Silas frowned, a dangerous shadow crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" "My accountants scrub those accounts daily." "Your accountants are looking for traditional skimming," Maya said, her voice steadying as she tapped a manicured finger against a thick file. "I've been reviewing the Foundation's offshore escrow accounts. There's a repeating fractional diversion in the supply chain logistics. Every time your shell company, Apex Holdings, purchases medical equipment for the hospitals, there is a micro-transaction routed through a subsidiary in Cyprus, a subsidiary registered to a man named Gregory." Silas froze. Gregory was his chief financial officer, a man who had been with the syndicate for 5 years. "How do you know this?" Silas demanded, stepping closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over her. "You are a waitress, Maya. You don't have a background in forensic accounting." Maya took a deep breath, meeting the storm-grey eyes of the most dangerous man in the city without flinching. It was time to stop hiding. "No, I don't," Maya confessed, "because my real name isn't Maya Brooks. It's Maya Petrov." Silas's jaw tightened. "Petrov, as in Nikolai Petrov, the Romanov syndicate's former bookkeeper? The one Victor murdered 10 years ago when he seized power," Maya confirmed, her voice thick with old, buried grief. "My father was an accounting genius. He had an eidetic memory. He memorized Victor's entire laundering network. When Victor found out, he had my father killed. My mother, Martha, knew we were next, so she dropped our last name, took me, and ran." "And she hid you in plain sight," Silas murmured, the pieces violently clicking together in his mind. "She took a job scrubbing floors in my house. because she knew my estate was the one place in the world Viktor Romanov would never dare to enter. Yes, Maya whispered. I inherited my father's memory. I was a mathematics prodigy, Silas. I was accepted into MIT at 16. But when my mother got sick, the medical bills destroyed everything. I had to drop out. I had to become invisible. I served champagne to the men who murdered my father, smiling at them, waiting for the day I could finally make them pay. Silas stared at the woman standing before him. He had thought he was saving a helpless, starving maid's daughter. He had underestimated her entirely. She wasn't a fragile bird he had pulled from the cold. She was a brilliant, dormant weapon that had been hiding in his own home for a decade. A slow, dark smile spread across Silas's face, a smile that promised absolute ruin for his enemies. He reached out, his large hands gripping her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "You memorized Victor's old ledgers?" Silas asked, his voice a low, rough purr. "Every single account number," Maya breathed, her heart pounding against his. "And I know exactly how to bankrupt him." 3 days later, the underworld was in a state of chaotic suspense. Rumors swirled that Silas Sterling had vanished, terrified into hiding after the hit at Le Bernardin. Emboldened by his apparent victory, Viktor Romanov decided to make a public show of his newfound supremacy. He hosted an opulent, exclusive gala at the Waldorf Astoria, inviting the city's corrupt politicians and rival bosses to witness his hostile takeover of the Sterling Empire. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf was dripping with excess. Chandeliers glittered above tables laden with imported caviar and vintage champagne. Viktor stood at the center of the room, flanked by his heavily armed guards, laughing loudly as he toasted to his own genius. He didn't notice the new catering staff seamlessly navigating the room, and he certainly didn't notice the woman in the sleek, understated black uniform standing by the main power grid controls in the service hallway. Upstairs, in a rented luxury suite directly above the ballroom, Silas sat at a mahogany desk, surrounded by high-tech decryption servers. A wireless earpiece rested in his ear. "I'm in position, Silas." Maya's voice crackled through the comms. She was perfectly calm. She was in her element. "Executed Malenkaya Tichka, little bird," Silas replied, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. Down in the ballroom, Viktor tapped his glass with a fork. The music faded, and the room fell silent. "My friends," Viktor sneered, his scarred face twisted in a victorious grin. "Tonight marks the end of an era. Silas Sterling is a coward, hiding in the woods. Tomorrow I absorb his assets. Tomorrow this city belongs to the Romanovs." Suddenly, the massive double doors of the ballroom swung open with a deafening crash. The crowd gasped. Viktor's guards drew their weapons. Silas Sterling walked into the room. He wasn't hiding. He was flanked by 20 heavily armed men in tactical gear, including the hulking figure of Gideon. Silas wore a midnight black suit, his hands casually tucked into his pockets, looking utterly bored by the weapons pointed at his chest. "You talk too much, Viktor," Silas said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the dead-silent room. Viktor recovered from his shock, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. "You walked right into your own grave, Silas. Kill him." "I wouldn't do that." A sharp, clear female voice echoed from the grand staircase. Every head in the room turned. Standing at the top of the marble stairs, stripped of her waitress uniform and dressed in a breathtaking, floor-length crimson gown that screamed absolute power, was Maya. She held a sleek silver tablet in her hands. Viktor squinted at her, confusion washing over his face. "The waitress, are you using your little pet as a shield, Silas?" Maya descended the stairs slowly, her heels clicking against the marble. "I'm not a pet, Viktor. I'm Nikolai Petrov's daughter." The color violently drained from Viktor's face. The mention of the bookkeeper he had murdered a decade ago hit him like a physical blow. "That's impossible. The Petrovs are dead." "Not all of them," Maya said coldly, stopping next to Silas. Silas smoothly placed a protective, possessive hand on the small of her back. "While you were busy toasting to your victory, Viktor, I was busy accessing your offshore accounts, the ones my father set up for you, the ones I memorized. Maya tapped the screen of the tablet. Instantly, the massive projector screens lining the ballroom walls, intended to display Victor's new corporate logo, flashed to life. But they didn't show a logo. They displayed live feeds of bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Cyprus, accounts registered to Victor Romanov. "You underestimated the people who serve you, Victor," Maya said, her voice laced with the hard, undeniable karma of a decade of suffering. "You treat the staff like they are invisible, like they are garbage. You throw away food while people starve. You murder the people who build your empire." She looked him dead in the eye, the terrified maid's daughter entirely gone, replaced by the lethal architect of his destruction. "Did you know that if you enter the wrong master decryption key into your Swiss accounts 3 times, it triggers a hostile asset freeze, permanently transferring the funds to an anonymous international charity?" Victor lunged forward, his eyes wide with panic. "No, wait!" Maya tapped the tablet one final time. On the massive screens, the balances of every single one of Victor's accounts, billions of dollars in blood money, simultaneously dropped to $0. The ballroom erupted into sheer chaos. Victor's own allies and politicians began to back away from him in horror. Without his money, Victor was nothing. He couldn't pay his guards. He couldn't pay his bribes. He was instantly, permanently ruined. Victor let out an animalistic scream, snatching a gun from his guard and aiming it directly at Maya. But Silas was faster. Before Victor could even raise the barrel, Silas's Glock was in his hand. 2 deafening shots rang out. Victor Romanov collapsed to the marble floor, his reign of terror over the city ending in a pool of his own blood. The room fell into a terrified, breathless silence. Silas holstered his weapon. He didn't look at the body. He looked down at Maya, his storm-grey eyes burning with a mixture of dark pride and overwhelming desire. She had taken down an empire with a tablet and her mind. "Come, Mrs. Sterling," Silas murmured, the title slipping from his lips naturally, a vow made in the center of the carnage. "I believe we have a city to run." Maya looked up at the man who had found her, hiding in a freezer, starving and broken. He had given her food, he had saved her mother, and he had given her the power to avenge her father. She smiled, slipping her hand into his. The invisible girl was finally seen, and she was never going back to the shadows again. The power vacuum left by Victor Romanov's demise could have plunged the eastern seaboard into a bloody gang war. Instead, it was silenced by a ghost. Operating from the penthouse of Silas's towering Manhattan headquarters, Maya didn't use bullets to dismantle their remaining enemies. She used offshore tax law and the very ledgers she had memorized as a child. Within weeks, Maya systematically hunted down every rogue lieutenant who had pledged loyalty to Victor. With a few keystrokes and the deployment of master decryption keys, she froze their hidden assets in Belize and Zurich. It was a bloodless massacre. Men who commanded armies suddenly found their credit lines severed, surrendering their territories to Silas without a single shot fired. They were terrified of the invisible woman who could erase their entire net worth before breakfast. "Hard karma is a beautiful thing," Silas murmured one evening, pressing a kiss to her temple as she finalized the hostile takeover of the medical insurance conglomerate that had denied her mother's treatments. Maya restructured their policies, ensuring Martha, now recovering beautifully in a sun-drenched Hamptons estate, and countless others would never face that desperation again. 6 months later, Silas and Maya stood on their Tribeca balcony, the glittering skyline of the city they now ruled spread beneath them. Silas reached into his pocket, producing a flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring. "This city belongs to you," Silas said, his storm-grey eyes locked onto hers with absolute devotion. "And so do I. Permanently." Maya slipped the ring onto her finger, looking at the man who had found her starving in a freezing pantry. He had given her a shield, and she had sharpened his sword. Together they ruled the shadows, untouchable and utterly unbreakable. That concludes the incredible story of Maya and Silas. From a starving waitress hiding in a freezing pantry to the brilliant queen of a multi-billion-dollar empire, Maya proved that true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits patiently in the shadows. Silas Sterling found a terrified girl eating his leftovers, but what he truly discovered was his greatest weapon and his only weakness. Their journey through the treacherous underworld shows that loyalty and intellect are the deadliest forces of all. If you enjoyed this thrilling mafia romance and love stories where the underestimated underdog finally gets their brutal revenge, please hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with fellow audiobook and drama lovers. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another high-stakes, real-life inspired romance. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next story.